the spring of 1942, deep inside the Naval War College in Tokyo, the room was silent except for the clicking of wooden markers sliding across a giant map of the Pacific Ocean. The most experienced officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy had gathered for a ritual they believed could predict the future: the annual war game. For decades, these simulations guided Japan's strategy. And now, with the Pacific War raging, they were about to decide the fate of an empire. Long tables were covered with miniature ships, color-coded symbols, and stacks of documents. The map was almost the size of the room, stretching from Hawaii to the Philippines. A faint smell of ink, cigarette smoke, and polished wood filled the air. At the center stood Admiral Agaki, one of Japan's sharpest strategic minds. His voice was calm when he announced the goal of the exercise. "We will simulate the coming battle with the United States. The result will guide our next operations." The game began. Dice rolled. Orders were issued. American carriers moved across the map like silent predators. Japanese scout planes searched desperately for them. Hours passed. Then the room stiffened. According to the simulation, American dive bombers located the Japanese fleet first, and in a single coordinated strike, sank several of Japan's top carriers. The war game predicted a disaster. A few officers exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew this outcome mirrored a frightening truth. Japan's naval strength depended on a few fragile carriers, and the United States was already producing more. If the simulation was correct, Japan's early victories were only an illusion, and the war would soon turn against them. Admiral Agaki stared at the map. The silence was heavy. Finally, someone muttered, "Should we accept such a result?" Another officer, embarrassed, whispered, "Perhaps the dice were unfavorable. Perhaps the risk is exaggerated." One by one, senior commanders suggested adjustments. They argued the U.S. attack was too lucky. They insisted Japanese pilots were superior and would never allow such a strike. Slowly, the losses on the map were erased. The sunk carriers were restored. The simulation resumed with a more honorable version of reality. But the junior officers watching from the edges of the room understood what had just happened. The war game had told the truth, and the truth had been rejected. A quiet lesson settled into the air. Japan was preparing for a war it did not fully understand, guided not by reality but by pride. Weeks later, at Midway, the real battle unfolded almost exactly as the original simulation had warned. American planes found the Japanese carriers first. Explosions lit the sky, and within hours, Japan lost the heart of its fleet. Not because of fate, but because the warning had been ignored. The war game had already decided the war. Japan simply refused to believe it. Inside the dimly lit hall of the Japanese Naval War College, the officers gathered around the enormous Pacific map already knew the truth they were trying to avoid. The first round of the war game had ended in embarrassment. The dice predicted that Japan's proud carrier fleet would be ambushed and destroyed by American forces. It was a warning written as clearly as if the ocean itself had spoken. But instead of accepting the result, the room filled with shifting glances, forced coughs, and the quiet rustle of uniforms. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. The Empire's dream of unstoppable victory might be an illusion. Admiral Agaki leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the tiny wooden marker representing the carrier Akagi, the same ship that had been sunk in the simulation minutes earlier. The map looked wrong to him, not because the prediction was unrealistic, but because it was unacceptable. For years, Japan's military doctrine was shaped by the belief that spirit and discipline could compensate for industrial weakness. Now, the dice had challenged that belief. A senior officer finally broke the silence. "This scenario seems excessively pessimistic," he said cautiously. "Our pilots would never allow such a concentrated attack." Several heads nodded. It was easier to blame the dice than confront reality. Another officer added, "Perhaps the American approach vector in the simulation is flawed. It gives them too much advantage." The suggestion spread quickly. adjust the rules, change the assumptions, tilt the board until the outcome matched the pride of the empire. Agaki hesitated, then agreed. A new rule was announced. American aircraft detection would be delayed. Another rule: Japanese anti-aircraft fire would be more effective. A third: enemy damage roles must be reevaluated. One by one, the officers reshaped the scenario not to test strategy, but to confirm what they wanted to believe. The dice rolled again, and this time, magically, Japan prevailed. Cheers and relieved smiles replaced the earlier tension. It didn't matter that the new rules had been created solely to protect egos. On paper, Japan looked invincible again. The war game had been rewritten to match fantasy, not reality. Yet, in the back of the room, several junior officers watched in stunned disbelief. They understood what the senior commanders refused to admit. The empire had forced the dice to lie, and in doing so, it had blinded itself to the danger ahead. Weeks later, as the real Battle of Midway unfolded, the truth returned with brutal clarity. American planes struck first, just as the original simulation had predicted. Carriers burned. Explosions lit the ocean. Dozens of Japan's best aviators were lost in minutes. The officers who had changed the rules never spoke publicly about the war game again. But they remembered. They remembered how a wooden map had given them a chance to prepare, and how pride had pushed them to erase it. History would record Midway as a turning point. But the real defeat happened weeks before, in a quiet room where the dice had told the truth, and the truth had been rewritten. The morning sky above the Pacific looked calm, almost innocent, a soft blue canvas stretching to the horizon. But beneath that peaceful surface waited a truth Japan's admirals had refused to face. The ocean does not care about pride, doctrine, or wishful thinking. It punishes mistakes without hesitation, and it never forgives arrogance. Weeks after the rigged war games in Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy sailed with the confidence of men who believed they had already rewritten destiny. Their carriers cut through the waves like floating fortresses, each one stacked with seasoned pilots and planes polished to perfection. The officers walked the decks convinced that American forces would crumble just as easily as they had in the adjusted simulations. But the Pacific had its own rules, and unlike the war games, these could not be changed. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the first blow struck quietly. American reconnaissance planes had found the fleet earlier than expected. It was exactly what the original simulation predicted, but the Admiralty had dismissed that scenario as unrealistic. Now it was happening in real time, and the officers could only stare in disbelief. The carriers scrambled to launch fighters. Deck crews ran between fuel hoses and bombs, rushing to arm aircraft for a counterstrike. The smell of aviation gasoline filled the air, sharp, dangerous, volatile. Then came the sound. A distant drone at first, barely noticeable over the ocean's wind. But it grew, and grew, until the men on the decks looked up and saw dark shapes cutting through the sky. American dive bombers plunging like iron spears from the clouds. In the war game, attacks like these had been nerfed, softened by rewritten rules. In real life, they were unstoppable. The first bomb hit Kaga. A fireball erupted, sending debris and bodies into the sea. Another bomb struck Akagi moments later, igniting the fuel-covered deck like dry straw. The explosions rolled across the fleet in terrifying sequence, each one a reminder of the truth the officers had tried to bury. The Pacific was not impressed by altered dice. Panic broke across the carriers. Men shouted orders drowned out by roaring flames. Pilots who moments earlier believed in Japan's invincibility now watched their ships dissolve into fire and steel. Some tried to launch aircraft in hopeless attempts to fight back, but collapsing decks and rising smoke made escape nearly impossible. Admiral Nagumo, who once brushed off unfavorable predictions, stood frozen as reports poured in. One carrier gone, 2 carriers aflame, a third hit moments later. It felt unreal, like watching the war game play out, but without the ability to adjust the parameters. Reality had returned, and it demanded payment. Within hours, Japan's most elite naval aviation force, the pride of the empire, lay shattered across the waves. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots were gone. For carriers, the very heart of Japan's strategic power, were sinking. As the smoke drifted over the endless blue horizon, officers who had laughed during the war game now faced a truth far harsher than any simulated defeat. The Pacific does not care about illusions. It does not respect confidence. It only answers to preparation and punishes those who pretend. The ocean had spoken just as the original dice had tried to. Japan had ignored both warnings. And now, reality struck with a force greater than any bomb. The realization that the empire's dream of dominance had ended in a single morning. The defeat at Midway did not just sink 4 Japanese carriers. It shattered the illusion of an empire that believed victory was destiny. Before that day, Tokyo spoke confidently of a war they thought they could not possibly lose. After all, they had swept through Asia and the Pacific with overwhelming speed, crushing every obstacle in their path. From Hong Kong to Singapore, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, they had carved out what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But empires built on overconfidence rarely see the cracks until the whole structure starts to fall. The first domino dropped at Midway, and its impact echoed across thousands of miles. Suddenly, the Japanese Navy, once the most feared force in the Pacific, found itself on the defensive for the first time. Their elite pilots were gone, their carrier fleet crippled, and their ability to project power shattered. What remained was a navy trying to fight a modern war with fewer ships, fewer pilots, and dwindling fuel. But Japan's leaders refused to believe the truth. Instead of reassessing their strategy, they doubled down, convinced that spirit and willpower alone could overcome material shortages and American industrial might. They declared that Japan would fight harder. They tightened propaganda, insisting the empire was still invincible. Newspapers told people not to worry. Victory was inevitable. Reality did not agree. The next domino fell at Guadalcanal. Japanese troops, hardened and fearless, fought with incredible determination. But they were sent into battle with weak logistics, outdated equipment, and virtually no air cover. American planes, launched from carriers Japan no longer had, tore through supply convoys, sinking ships before they could deliver food, ammunition, or reinforcements. Starvation became a bigger enemy than the U.S. Marines. Still, Tokyo refused to accept the obvious. They expected their soldiers to hold territory without the resources needed to survive, let alone win. The generals insisted a decisive victory was coming. The admirals promised the fleet would turn the tide. And the war machine continued grinding forward, even as its gears began breaking apart. By 1944, another domino tipped, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan launched what it believed would be a massive counterstrike, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But without trained pilots, it turned into a one-sided slaughter. Waves of inexperienced aviators were shot down before they could even reach the American fleet. Carriers that had once symbolized Japanese naval power became burning wrecks. The empire was bleeding to death, but its leaders kept pretending the wounds were minor. Factories struggled to build planes without aluminum. Fuel reserves ran perilously low. Entire islands were cut off by American submarine blockades. The so-called invincible fortresses, the same ones in the war games, became isolated pockets of starving soldiers, abandoned because Japan no longer had the means to supply them. By the time American forces reached the Philippines and then Iwo Jima, the collapse was no longer a chain of falling dominoes, it was a landslide. Every attempt Japan made to stabilize the front only accelerated the disaster. Their army was overstretched, their navy crippled, and their air force reduced to desperate kamikaze missions. And yet, even as the empire disintegrated, the leadership clung to the same illusion that had doomed them from the beginning, that they could not lose simply because they believed they wouldn't. When the final domino fell in 1945, it surprised no one except Japan's own war planners. The nation that thought it would win quickly and decisively had lost everything: ships, soldiers, cities, and ultimately the war itself. All because they ignored the truth. Victory is never guaranteed, and arrogance is the first step toward defeat. In the last year of the Pacific War, Japan was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting to avoid admitting defeat. What had begun as confident expansion across Asia had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Yet Tokyo's leaders clung to pride like a life raft made of stone. And that pride, more than any American bomb or battleship, became the weight that dragged the empire under. By 1945, Japan's military situation was catastrophic. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of the nation, was largely gone, sunk at Midway, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, and by relentless American submarines. The Air Force barely existed, reduced to kamikaze units because there were not enough trained pilots left for conventional operations. Entire divisions of the Army were stranded on islands without food or ammunition, slowly starving in bunkers they were told were impregnable. But the truth was brutally simple. Japan had lost the war long before Tokyo was willing to say the words. The tragedy is that many generals knew it. They had seen the reports: factories running out of metals, fuel reserves nearly gone, merchant shipping destroyed, and American bombers approaching the home islands with no resistance. Some officers, like Admiral Toyota and General Ushijima, whispered privately that surrender was inevitable. Yet publicly, they repeated the same empty promises: fight on. Victory is still possible. One more decisive battle. It wasn't hope. It was pride refusing to face reality. The government feared that admitting defeat would shatter the national spirit, dishonor the emperor, and destroy the myth of Japanese invincibility. So they chose destruction instead of acceptance. Cities burned under American firebombs. Civilians starved. Soldiers died in hopeless counterattacks, not because the war could be won, but because the leadership refused to be the first to say, enough. The clearest example of this pride was the Battle of Okinawa. Even though Japan lacked supplies, aircraft, and reinforcements, the High Command ordered the defenders to fight to the last man. They hoped this bloodshed would convince the United States to negotiate more favorable terms. But instead, it convinced Washington that Japan would never surrender unless forced to. That decision sealed the fate of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Even after the first atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima, many Japanese generals insisted the empire should keep fighting. They argued that spirit would defeat American ground forces if the U.S. invaded. They believed the emperor's subjects would rather die than accept surrender. And they believed, absurdly, that Japan still had options. But on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito finally broke the illusion. In a calm, sorrowful voice broadcast to the entire nation, he acknowledged what his military leaders refused to admit. The war was lost. The empire had been defeated not just by American power, but by its own refusal to accept the truth when it still had choices. Pride had blinded its commanders. Pride had silenced dissent. Pride had turned every island, every city, every battalion into another sacrifice to a war that no longer had meaning. The final lesson of Japan's downfall is not simply about strategy or firepower. It is about the danger of believing you cannot lose. When leaders protect their egos instead of their people, when they cling to illusions instead of adapting, their collapse becomes inevitable. In the end, Japan's empire did not die because it was weak. It died because it refused to recognize its limits. And that is how pride, quiet, stubborn, and uncompromising, sank an empire that once believed it was unbreakable.